Hello everyone, I'm Elif Aslan, a second year student from Industrial Design Department, and this is my final presentation. Ever since from the 19th century, the most discussed topic in art is that should art be for art's sake or should art be for society's sake? But how can art be for society's sake? How can it impact the lives of people in society? Today, I'm going to talk about the two effects art has on society. The first effect art has on society is the preservation of history. Now, painters are first-hand witnesses to historical events. So, their paintings contain valid historical information about these events. For example, we see here Goya's painting 3rd of May that describes the Peninsula War that happened in 1808. We see here a resistance group getting caught by Napoleon's army and being executed by them on 3rd of May 1808. Now, this is a good painting on the horrors of war, but it also contains a lot of historical information. For example, we see the resistance group very clearly. We see their clothing, we see their hats and their expressions, and we see the Napoleon's army and their uniform and their rifles. And we see men here covering their eyes because they're horrified. We see dead bodies, more men about to be executed by the army. And this painting represents the atmosphere of those days in a great way that just written sources cannot. Another way we can preserve history through art is that art represents women and other marginalized groups, says Burke in his 1991 article. He says exactly, social historians have used art to learn about the culture of socially invisible people, often women or other marginalized groups, many of whom are illiterate and therefore not as well represented in written and recorded artifacts. A great example of this is Osman Hamdi Bey and his paintings. Now, in a conservative society, like Ottoman society, women were illiterate, like Burke says. They couldn't write novels, they couldn't write poems, and they couldn't paint most of the time. But also, they were not represented in these works either. For example, writers didn't write about women. Poets, most of the time, talked about their love, but they did not talk about the women they loved, they just talked about themselves. And the miniature paintings of those times generally showed women. However, Osman Hamdi Bey, one of the most well-known painters of Ottoman history, painted women a lot actually. Most of his paintings convey women in a way that we can see very clearly. For example, you see here, they're outside and we can see very clearly what they're wearing and how they cover their faces and their eyes and how they dress in public. And on the top here we see a woman getting undressed, uncovering her hair inside her house. We can see again her clothing, for example. We can see what they do in daily life. And actually Osman Hamdi Bey's paintings are one of the very few examples we have that shows us how women live in Ottoman society. Another way to preserve history through art is that art serves as social commentary and protest to historical events, says Ray in her 2006 article. Now, this is one of the most famous paintings in art history. It is Guernica by Pablo Picasso, and it describes the bombing of a Spanish village called Guernica. It happened in 1936, and the village was bombed by Hitler's Nazi Germany. The Nazi airplanes, dropped 100,000 pounds of explosive into the village in 3 hours. They destroyed the whole village. And even if people managed to survive, they shot them down. So they made a complete massacre there. And Pablo Picasso tried to capture that moment, that day in this painting. And we see, when we look at the painting here, we see a dead man here. We see a woman screaming with a dead child on her arm. We see a horse probably dying. We see a man here in flames, and we see arms and legs and heads everywhere, and the painting everywhere on it, there is death. Now, it's a great example of a political painting, but it also serves as a social memory and a painting that makes us remember the war and the horrors of war. And we cannot, for example, talk about the bombing of Guernica without talking about this painting. Now, another way that arts affect society is the economic development. Now, we know that art is linked to economy. If economy crashes, if economy decreases, artistic activities also decrease because there's no money for them, because they're not a priority, right? And if economy flourishes, if economy develops, then there's also an increase in the number of artistic activities because now we have money for them. This is how most people view the relationship between the two. However, studies that are made, for example, like Myers-Squibb in 1988 and Witt in 1987, in their studies that they say that it doesn't have to be economy that lead to art. It can be art that makes an economy develop. And art can increase labor and it can increase productivity and develop a country's economy. Now, the graphic here you see is made by Ernst & Young, is a study made by Ernst & Young, and it is presented by UNESCO. Here we see the contribution of creative industries to global economy. Now, this study is made in 2015, and we see here visual arts and advertising and architecture and books and movies, like industries we refer to as art. And if we add up all their revenues, it makes us 3% of the world's GDP. That is a huge contribution to global economy. And also, we know that art sector is the sector that employs the most number of people that are in the ages of 15 and 29. And the percentage of women working in the art sector is actually more than the percentage of women that are working in other sectors. This means art sector is a great job opportunity for young people and women. Also, here, if we add up these numbers, we see that art sector hired 29.5 million in 2015. That makes up 1% of the whole world active generation, working generation. That is a huge number and a huge advantage in employment. Also, we know that accessibility in art in a place makes that place more attractive to visit, both to visit and to work and to live in there. So this all means that art is not a hobby or not a luxury that most people view it to be. It actually has great contribution both to world economy and world history. And with the absence of art, the world would suffer greatly for it. This is my reference list, and thank you for listening to me.